She gave up her heart to close the rift. But was she right to choose the universe over love? What if love didn't come from your heart, but from the stars? Could you love a being who isn't human? Or would the very essence of love itself be torn apart by the sheer impossibility of it? There's a question we all ask ourselves at some point. What if the greatest love of your life didn't come from someone you knew? What if it came from a place far, far beyond? From a world where everything is different, where even the air you breathe feels unfamiliar? Could love survive this vast difference? Could it endure when the very nature of existence defies it? On one fateful night, I received a message. Not from a person I knew, not from a lover or a friend, but from somewhere so far away. It felt like it belonged to another reality altogether. A voice, a whisper was sent to me across the universe. But it wasn't just any message. It was a call. A love story was about to unfold. Not between two human beings, but between a human and someone, or something else. But here's the twist. Could love between two such different worlds, one from Earth, the other from a distant galaxy, ever truly work? Or is love destined to shatter when the very fabric of reality is stretched too far? Stick around, because this story will take you beyond your wildest dreams, and perhaps even your wildest fears. The cold vastness of space stretched endlessly in front of him as Kale floated in his ship, his hand gently grasping the controls. His muscular frame was calm, poised, as he piloted through the thick darkness of the galaxy. The light from distant stars barely illuminated the cockpit, casting an eerie glow on his sharp, blue eyes. His black hair, cut short in military fashion, contrasted against the dark metal of the ship, but his mind wasn't focused on the darkness outside. Instead, it was on the faintly flickering signal that had come from deep in the unknown. Approaching the coordinates, he muttered to himself, his voice deep and unwavering. What the hell are they sending us to? His mission was simple: track the anomaly, find the source, and report back to Earth. But he could sense something was off. This signal wasn't just a random distress call. It was a message, a cry for help, and his instincts told him this was more than a routine mission. Suddenly, a rift in space appeared before him. The fabric of reality itself seemed to tear open, revealing a glowing, swirling vortex, a cosmic rift unlike anything Kale had seen before. It pulsed with energy, as if it were alive. He took a deep breath, his heart racing. His fingers danced across the controls, attempting to pull back, but the gravitational pull of the rift was too strong. "This is it," he whispered, eyes narrowed. "I'm not turning back now." As the ship was pulled into the rift, everything around him blurred into a storm of light and darkness. His ship twisted and turned, spinning wildly as the fabric of space itself seemed to stretch and fold. His body was pinned against the seat, and for a moment, he wondered if this was the end. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the chaos ceased. The ship's engines sputtered to life again, and Kale found himself in a strange new realm. Outside, the view was breathtaking. Lyra's home planet, a shimmering world of verdant jungles, crystal clear oceans, and sprawling cities that hovered among the clouds, lay before him. The air was thick with unfamiliar energies, the colors more vibrant than any earthly landscape. This was no ordinary planet. But the most striking feature wasn't the world itself, it was the woman standing on the other side of the observation window. Lyra. Her figure appeared like a vision from another dimension. Her long, white hair cascaded down her back, glowing softly as if illuminated by the stars themselves. Her deep, violet eyes locked with his, sending a shockwave of energy through his body. Her skin, the color of emerald, glistened with an otherworldly glow, and her form was impossibly alluring, slender yet powerful, with curves that seemed to defy gravity itself. She stood tall, her delicate, pointed ears peeking through her silken locks. Her attire, a deep green ensemble, hugged her body in all the right ways, revealing the sleek contours of her athletic frame. The low-cut top was both daring and elegant, giving off a sense of both power and restraint. As she approached, Kale couldn't help but feel drawn to her, not just by her beauty, but by the aura of strength and mystery she radiated. There was something about her, something dangerous, yet entrancing. "You came," Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone smooth, almost melodic, yet carrying a certain weight. Kale's breath hitched. He could feel the chemistry between them, electric, tangible. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. He straightened in his seat, standing tall and steady, his powerful frame a stark contrast to her delicate yet commanding presence. "I had no choice," he replied, his voice low and confident. "The rift, it brought me here." Lyra's smile was enigmatic, almost as if she had known this moment would come. "The rift did more than that," she said, her eyes scanning him with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. "It brought you to me, Kale. And now, your journey begins." As she stepped closer, the air between them thickened, and Kale couldn't deny the pull, an undeniable force that was drawing him toward her. Her scent was intoxicating, a blend of something floral and earthy, with an undertone of ancient power. The space between them seemed to shrink with every passing second. But there was something more, something deeper, that he couldn't quite grasp yet. "What is it you need from me?" Kale asked, his voice steady, though his pulse raced with excitement and curiosity. Lyra's smile widened, a glint of something ancient and powerful flashing in her violet eyes. "Everything." The moment she spoke, Kale felt the surge of energy ripple through him. A moment of silence passed as they stood in the same space, their gazes locked, the connection undeniable. The hum of the ship's engines reverberated through Kale's chest as Lyra led him deeper into the heart of the towering structure, her presence a magnetic force pulling him forward. The path was lined with intricate, glowing symbols that danced along the walls, pulsing with energy. The air was thick with the scent of ancient flora, a mixture of exotic spices and something sweet, almost intoxicating. Kale couldn't help but steal glances at Lyra as she moved ahead of him. Every step she took seemed deliberate, as if she was aware of his gaze, but she didn't acknowledge it. Instead, her violet eyes were fixed ahead, her long, white hair flowing effortlessly behind her, as though gravity had little sway over her. The way she moved was graceful, but also predatory. There was an undeniable strength in her. "This way," she spoke, her voice as serene as ever but with an undercurrent of urgency. "You must see the heart of Althera." Kale, following her through the sleek, futuristic corridors, tried to focus on her words, but the pull between them was like an electric charge, keeping him entranced. Every time they passed each other, their bodies brushed lightly, sending jolts of energy through him. His muscles tensed in response, the connection growing stronger with every moment. His mind buzzed with thoughts he couldn't quite grasp, questions, desires, and an overpowering sense of destiny. Soon, they entered a vast chamber, its ceiling stretching far above them, disappearing into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light. In the center of the room was a massive crystal, pulsating with an ethereal glow. Lyra moved toward it, and Kale instinctively followed. "This is the heart of Althera," she said, her voice reverberating in the room as the crystal's light intensified. "It is the source of my people's power, and the key to saving my world." The crystal was beautiful, its surfaces shimmering in ways that made Kale's eyes water. But it was also alive, its energy resonating with a strange, alien hum that seemed to call to something deep within him. Lyra stood before the crystal, raising her hand. The air around them vibrated as a shock wave of raw energy pulsed outward. The crystal responded, glowing brighter and brighter until the room seemed to shake with power. Kale felt the energy flood into him, a warmth spreading through his chest, and for the briefest moment, he felt as though he could understand everything: the nature of the rift, the power that connected him and Lyra, the force that was binding them together. His heart raced. "It's incredible," Kale whispered, unable to take his eyes off the glowing crystal. "You control all this?" Lyra nodded, her eyes focused on the crystal's light, the reflection of the power in her gaze sharp and piercing. "I do. But it is a power that comes at a great cost. The rift is tearing through the fabric of our universe, and only through the heart can we restore balance. But to do that, I need your help, Kale." Kale felt the weight of her words, his mind racing with the implications. He was just a soldier, a pilot. How could he help her? How could he control something so powerful, so dangerous? Before he could speak, Lyra turned to face him. There was something different in her eyes now, something raw, something desperate. "You don't understand yet, Kale," she said softly, but there was a tremor in her voice. "The bond between us, it is more than just attraction. It's the rift. It's fate." Kale's heart skipped a beat. The air between them seemed to crackle, and he could feel the tension building, thick and palpable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra stepped closer, her breath warm against his skin. He couldn't pull away. He didn't want to. Her presence was overwhelming, consuming, and yet he felt as if he could lose himself in it. She reached out, her hand gently brushing against his chest, where the energy from the crystal had surged through him. "It's the power of the rift," she explained, her voice a whisper now. "We are connected, Kale. My power is linked to yours. And when we are together, truly together, the rift will stabilize. But the price..." She trailed off, and Kale felt the heavy weight of her words. He could feel the heat of her touch, her delicate fingers pressing into him, each contact sending a shock wave through his body. His mind was spinning, his heart racing. The pull between them was undeniable, he could feel it in every part of him. a magnetic force that seemed to drag him closer to her. And as her fingers brushed his jaw, he knew what would happen next. He couldn't resist. Their lips met in a fierce, desperate kiss. One that spoke of more than just attraction, but of destiny. Of a bond they both couldn't understand but couldn't deny. The moment their lips touched, the energy between them exploded, sending a rush of warmth through their bodies, lighting up the space around them. Lyra's breath hitched as she pulled back slightly, her violet eyes locking with his. "It has begun," she whispered. And in that moment, Kale knew nothing would ever be the same. The morning sun of Althera filtered through the massive crystalline windows, casting shimmering beams of light that danced across the room. Kale stood before the observation deck, staring out into the vast expanse of space. His thoughts were clouded, still reeling from the kiss he had shared with Lyra. The intensity of that moment of the rift, the power, the connection had left him breathless, uncertain of what was real and what was fate. Lyra stood beside him, silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her presence was magnetic, and though she said little, Kale could feel the weight of her emotions. There was a burden she carried, something heavier than the power of the heart of Althera, something she had yet to share with him. "What happened to your world?" Kale asked, his voice quiet but filled with genuine concern. He turned to face her, noting the way her features softened when she looked at him. Lyra sighed, a sound that echoed with centuries of sorrow. Her violet eyes met his, but they held a faraway look, as though she was seeing something he could not. "Our world," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "was once a paradise. Althera was vibrant, full of life, with technology and nature existing in perfect harmony. But now, we are dying." Her words struck Kale like a punch to the gut. He had seen civilizations fall, planets ravaged by war or disaster, but the way she spoke, the quiet resignation in her voice, made it clear that this destruction was something beyond mere physical ruin. It was as if Althera's very soul was being torn apart. "The rift," Lyra continued, her voice growing darker. "It was our doing. We opened it, thinking we could harness its power to fuel our world, to transcend time and space. But we didn't understand the consequences. The rift, it began to pull at the very fabric of our existence." Kale stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "But you were trying to save your people, right?" Lyra nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes. But the rift destabilized our planet. It shattered the fabric of space, causing massive disruptions in time. The damage spread quickly, destabilizing the atmosphere, causing earthquakes, storms, and something worse." She paused, and for a moment, Kale could sense her fear, a vulnerability she had never shown before. "The rift unleashed something beyond our comprehension, Kale. A force that we cannot control. A force that is coming for us." Kale felt a chill run down his spine. "What is it?" Her eyes flickered with an unsettling glow, the violet light in them flashing like a warning. "It is a being, an entity that feeds on the instability of the rift. It is called the Void. It has already begun to consume the outer regions of Althera, and it will not stop until it devours everything. So, the rift is the source of this entity?" Kale asked, his voice low and filled with dread. "Yes," Lyra said, her tone somber. "And it is also the only way we can stop it? The heart of Althera is the key to closing the rift, but it requires a sacrifice that I fear you may have to make, Kale." Kale felt a knot form in his stomach. What kind of sacrifice? Before Lyra could respond, a sharp, haunting noise pierced the air, followed by the sound of alarms blaring throughout the room. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the city. Kale instinctively grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her towards him as the floor began to crack open, debris falling from above. "We're not safe here," Lyra said, her eyes wide with alarm. "The void is here. It's come for us." With a swift motion, Lyra activated a hidden panel in the floor, revealing a secret passage leading deeper into the planet's core. She gestured for Kale to follow, her face set in determination. "We need to get to the control room. The void is attacking the heart, and if we don't act fast, it will destroy everything." Kale nodded, his grip on her tightening as they ran. He could feel the rumble of the planet shaking beneath their feet, the chaos escalating. The lights flickered, and in the distance, Kale could hear the guttural growls of someone coming for them. They descended into the passage, the walls glowing faintly with energy, but the deeper they went, the colder it became. The air grew heavier, and Kale's muscles tensed, ready for anything. "How can I help?" Kale asked, his voice firm as they navigated the dark, winding tunnels. Lyra looked at him, her gaze softening for just a moment. "Your connection to the rift, it's more powerful than you realize. You can stabilize the heart, Kale. You can help me close the rift and stop the void." But as she spoke, the air shifted. A terrifying, low hum vibrated through the walls, and a shadow moved at the edge of their vision. They both stopped, their eyes darting to the darkness ahead. Kale's heart skipped a beat as the shadow took form, a monstrous figure, its outline indistinct but terrifying, with eyes glowing like burning coals. "It's here," Lyra whispered, a chill in her voice. "The void." The silence between Kale and Lyra was deafening as they stood in the dark passageway, the air around them thick with tension. The shadowy figure of the void loomed in the distance, its presence unsettling in a way Kale couldn't explain. Every instinct in his body screamed to run, but something inside him told him to stay, to stand beside Lyra. Her hand brushed against his briefly, the touch light, but the jolt of energy that shot through him was immediate, intense. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto hers. The connection between them was undeniable, electric. "Kale," Lyra whispered, her voice shaking slightly but filled with purpose. "This is it. We must act now. If we don't, the void will consume everything." Kale nodded, his hand instinctively reaching out to hers, pulling her closer. Their bodies were drawn together by an invisible force, something neither of them could control. His breath quickened as her hand slipped into his, the warmth of her skin sending a shiver through his spine. But before either of them could speak, the ground shook again, a deep rumble that rattled their bones. Kale's grip on Lyra tightened as he pulled her towards him, his eyes scanning the dark passageway for any sign of movement. The void's growl rumbled through the air, low and menacing, as if it were feeding off the fear radiating from them both. Kale's chest tightened, his mind racing. The time for hesitation was over. There was no turning back now. Lyra's eyes flashed with determination, her violet gaze locking with his. "We're connected, Kale. Our bond, our touch, it's what can stop this. What can stabilize the rift?" Kale was taken aback by the intensity in her voice. He had always known there was something powerful between them, something that went beyond mere attraction. But now, in this moment of desperation, he realized the depth of their connection, how it was more than just fate. It was destiny. "How can we do it?" Kale asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lyra stepped closer, her body pressing against his. The air between them seemed to crackle with energy. "You must touch the heart of Althera," she said softly, her lips brushing his ear, sending a shock of heat through him. "Together, we can seal the rift." Her voice was barely a murmur now, her breath warm on his skin, mingling with the scent of the ancient, alien flowers that surrounded them. Kale's heart raced, his mind a blur of confusion and desire. The power between them was undeniable, pulling them together in a way that defied logic and reason. He leaned in, their lips barely grazing, the tension thick in the air. "I don't know if I can do this," he confessed, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "You can," she whispered, her hand resting against his chest, her touch sending sparks of warmth into his body. "Because we are meant to. Don't fight it, Kale. Let the power of the rift guide us." With that, she kissed him softly at first, but the moment their lips met, everything around them seemed to vanish. The world, the void, even time itself seemed to cease to exist as the energy between them surged. Kale's pulse raced, his senses overwhelmed by the force of their connection. He could feel the rift, the power of it, rushing through him, through Lyra. It was as if their bond unlocked something deep within, a power neither of them had fully understood before. The crystal beneath them began to hum, its energy vibrating with their touch, responding to the bond between them. Lyra pulled away slightly, her breath ragged, but her eyes never leaving his. "It's working," she gasped. "We're stabilizing the rift, but there's still more to do." Kale nodded, still reeling from the overwhelming sensations coursing through him. But he knew there was no turning back now. Together, they had to finish this. They had to close the rift before the void consumed everything. The ground shook once more, the void's growl now unmistakably closer. But Kale didn't flinch. His hand found Lyra's once again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. They were in this together. "We'll finish this," Kale said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. Lyra nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "Yes. Together." The air around Kale and Lyra felt charged, vibrating with energy as they stood before the glowing heart of Althera. The light from the crystal seemed to pulse in rhythm with their own hearts, a powerful connection that surged through their bodies every time their skin touched. But despite the energy that radiated between them, there was an unmistakable feeling of urgency. The void was close, and the threat to their world was real. As the rumble from the void grew louder, Lyra turned away from Kale, her expression shifting from determination to something darker, something heavier. She stepped toward the glowing crystal, her violet eyes fixed on its radiant core, but Kale noticed the faint tremor in her hands. There was something more beneath the surface of her calm demeanor, a secret she hadn't shared. "Lyra, what's happening?" Kale's voice was low, his brow furrowing as he moved closer. He had seen her strong, composed, but this was different. Her usual confident aura was now clouded with an unsettling sense of fear. She hesitated before turning back to face him. "There is something you need to understand, Kale," she said, her voice wavering just slightly, a vulnerability he had not seen in her until now. "The void, it's not just a creature. It's an entity born from the rift, an ancient force that feeds on the chaos it creates." Kale's confusion deepened. "What do you mean it's not just a creature?" "The void is alive," Lyra continued, her eyes flickering with a haunted look. "It has a will, a consciousness that seeks to destroy everything it touches. But the truth is, the void is also tied to me. Tied to the heart. Tied to the very energy of Aldera." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of implications. Kale took a step forward, his mind racing. "What does that mean for you?" Lyra's lips parted, but before she could answer, the ground trembled again, this time more violently. The rumble from the void had reached a terrifying crescendo. Kale instinctively grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her closer as the walls around them began to crack, sending chunks of stone crashing to the floor. "We don't have time," Kale said urgently, his voice firm as he held her close. The chaos around them intensified, and he could feel the tremors through the soles of his boots, his entire body vibrating with the force of the rift. Lyra closed her eyes for a brief moment, the weight of the truth she had just revealed settling deep within her. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with determination, no longer the flickering uncertainty he had seen earlier. "I'll explain later. Right now, we must stop the void before it destroys everything." The crystal beneath them began to hum more loudly, its glow intensifying, casting long shadows against the crumbling walls. Kale glanced at it, sensing the shift in its energy. The pulse was no longer harmonious, it was chaotic, unstable. "Is it too late?" Kale asked, his voice laced with concern. The connection between them felt more intense with each passing moment. The void was on the verge of consuming everything, and they were running out of time. Lyra stepped away from him, her eyes locked on the crystal, but her hands shook slightly. "No, not yet. The rift can still be sealed, but it requires both of us." Before Kale could respond, a dark, oppressive energy filled the chamber. The ground beneath them cracked open, and a massive, swirling vortex of darkness appeared, a manifestation of the void itself. Kale's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the swirling maelstrom that seemed to pull everything into it: air, light, matter. It was the embodiment of pure destruction. Kale's mind raced. "Lyra, we need to work together. You're the key to closing the rift, but we need to combine our strength to stabilize it." "I know," she said softly, her voice strained. "But Kale, you must understand, this power isn't just about saving my world. It's about controlling the void. And that's something no one has ever done." He moved toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no fear in him now, only the overwhelming need to protect her and the world she called home. "We'll do it together. We're stronger than this." Lyra nodded, her lips pressing into a tight line. She raised her hand toward the void, the air around her crackling with energy. As she did, Kale felt the familiar surge of power, but this time it was different. This time, the rift didn't just pull at him, it called to him, as if recognizing him as a part of the force that could close it. The very air around them seemed to bend, the space warping as their combined energy met the void head-on. But the void was not going to give up easily. The swirling mass of darkness shot tendrils of pure chaos toward them, crackling with energy. The tendrils reached out like grasping fingers, aiming to tear them apart. "Kale!" Lyra shouted, her voice barely audible above the roar of the void. "You must focus. Connect with me. Let the rift's power flow through us both." Kale reached out, his hands meeting hers. The moment their skin touched, a surge of energy flooded his veins, and he felt the rift's power coursing through him. The connection was immediate, overwhelming. Lyra's power melded with his, their combined energy forming a shield of light that began to push against the void. But the void wasn't giving up without a fight. The tendrils continued to press forward, battering against their combined energy. Kale could feel his body straining, his muscles burning with the effort to hold the shield in place. The rift had become more than just a physical force, it was a living entity, and the void fought to remain free. "Hold on." Lyra's voice was filled with pain, but there was no stopping now. The intensity of the void's energy was overwhelming, but together, they were stronger. The void roared in a fury around them, its tendrils pressing harder against the barrier Kale and Lyra had created, pushing them to their limits. Kale's body was drenched in sweat, muscles straining with the effort of holding back the darkness. The pain was excruciating, but there was something else, something beyond the physical strain. Lyra was beside him, her face a mask of concentration, but the intensity of their bond, the shared energy flowing between them, was palpable. Kale could feel every beat of her heart, every breath she took, as if they were one. Her power was strong, but it was clear that the void was too much to contain for much longer. "Kale, we can't hold it much longer." Lyra's voice cracked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The light surrounding them flickered as the void's darkness pressed harder against the shield. We need to focus all our energy together. It's the only way to close the rift." Kale's heart pounded in his chest, his gaze locked with hers. Her eyes, usually filled with confidence and strength, were now clouded with fear and desperation. But even in that moment, there was something else, a quiet, undeniable understanding. He could see it in the way she looked at him, the unspoken bond they shared. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers, feeling the warmth of her skin and the hum of energy that pulsed between them. They were not just fighting for their survival, they were fighting for each other. And in that moment, Kale knew he couldn't do this without her. "I'm with you, Lyra," Kale said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We can do this. Together." Their fingers intertwined, and in that instant, the energy between them surged with a force that made the void tremble. Lyra's eyes flickered with surprise, and Kale felt a rush of warmth flood his chest as the power of the rift connected them in ways neither of them had fully understood before. Their love, their bond, was more than just a source of strength, it was the key to overcoming the void. The energy around them intensified, the brilliant light of the rift swirling faster as the two of them poured everything they had into the barrier. The void howled in frustration, its dark tendrils writhing and snapping like chains, but Kale and Lyra didn't waver. Their connection was absolute. Kale. Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes were closed now, her focus entirely on the rift, but Kale could see the subtle change in her expression, her lips parting slightly, her breath growing shallow. I feel it. I feel the rift stabilizing. Kale could feel it too, the rift's power beginning to shift, the chaotic energy starting to settle. But as it did, a wave of exhaustion hit him, his vision blurring. His body ached, the strain of using the rift's energy to fight the void taking its toll. Lyra, too, was weakening, her grip on him faltering as her strength waned. But there was no time to rest. The void was not done with them yet. Lyra! Kale shouted, his voice raw as he pulled her closer. We're almost there. Don't stop. Her violet eyes opened, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. The raw intensity of their connection was like nothing Kale had ever experienced. It wasn't just love, it was an understanding, a shared purpose that transcended everything else. Without another word, Lyra took a deep breath, her body trembling as she closed her eyes again. Kale did the same, focusing everything he had on the rift. He could feel Lyra's energy intertwining with his, their powers combining in a way that was almost spiritual. Together, they reached out to the rift, and in that moment, it felt as if they had become one with the universe itself. A final surge of light exploded from them, blinding in its intensity. The rift began to close, the void howling in defeat as its power diminished. The tendrils that had once reached out to destroy them now shriveled, retreating back into the darkness. As the light from the rift began to fade, the oppressive presence of the void lifted, leaving them in a deep, suffocating silence. Kale's knees gave out as he collapsed to the ground, the last of his strength drained. Lyra, too, staggered and fell beside him, her body trembling from the effort. The room around them had gone completely still, the chaos they had faced fading into nothingness. Kale reached out for her, his fingers brushing her face, and for the first time since their connection began, they simply looked at each other, no words, just the shared understanding that they had done it. Together, they had saved Althera. You did it, Kale whispered, his voice hoarse but filled with awe. Lyra smiled weakly, her hand reaching out to touch his chest. No, we did it. And in that moment, as they sat amidst the aftermath of the battle, Kale realized that the connection they shared was more than just power, it was love. A love that had brought them together, a love that had saved their world. The dust had settled in the chamber, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on both Kale and Lyra. Their bodies were still recovering from the intense strain of closing the rift. Though the void had been repelled, the consequences of their actions were far from over. The air was heavy with the silence that followed the storm, the kind of silence that only comes after a great battle, where the echoes of victory are drowned in the uncertainty of what comes next. Kale sat against the cool stone wall, his head spinning, trying to gather his strength. His entire body ached, and yet, there was a deep sense of satisfaction that kept him grounded. They had succeeded. Aldera was saved. Pause. At least, that's what he wanted to believe. Lyra stood nearby, her eyes closed, her hands still trembling slightly. Her connection to the rift had been severed, but he could see the toll it had taken on her. There was an emptiness in her expression, as if a part of her had been left behind in the very heart of the battle. Kale pushed himself to his feet, his legs still unsteady. His gaze followed Lyra, a mixture of awe and concern filling him. She had fought alongside him, given everything she had, yet now, it was clear that something deeper, something unseen, lingered beneath the surface. Lyra, his voice was soft, almost hesitant as he stepped closer to her. "You're not okay." She turned to him, her violet eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I will be." Her voice was firm, but the cracks were there, hidden behind the resolve. "The rift is closed, Kale. Aldera is safe. For now." Kale took another step forward, reaching out to her, but she quickly stepped back, putting a few paces of distance between them. The space between them seemed to grow as the silence deepened. "Lyra," Kale said, his voice growing more insistent. "There's something you're not telling me." For a long moment, Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the large crystal that had been the source of their power. Her fingers traced its surface, her expression unreadable. "The rift wasn't just a threat," she began, her voice distant as if she were speaking to herself. "It was a warning." Kale frowned, his heart sinking. "A warning?" Lyra nodded slowly, turning back to face him. "Yes. The rift was never meant to be opened. It was never meant to be controlled. The void wasn't the only thing that came through. When we sealed the rift, we only stopped one force. But there are others, darker forces waiting on the other side." Kale's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" Lyra took a deep breath. "The rift, it didn't just connect our worlds. It was a gateway, Kale. A gateway to dimensions beyond even my understanding. We've only begun to see the consequences." The realization hit Kale like a cold wave. The battle they had just fought might have stopped the void. But the ripple effect of the rift's closure was far from over. What they had done was merely the beginning of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. "So, what now?" Kale asked, his voice heavy with the weight of her words. "What are we supposed to do?" Lyra turned back to the crystal, her eyes narrowing. "We find the others." Before Kale could respond, the entire chamber began to shake. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the low hum of the heart of Aldera suddenly warped into a dissonant, alarming sound. The once stable crystal now flickered, its once steady pulse now erratic. "No." Lyra breathed, her eyes wide with panic. "It can't be." She rushed toward the crystal, Kale following closely behind, his heart racing. The energy in the chamber was shifting again, growing unstable. The crystal's glow turned from a soft, calming blue to a harsh, vibrant red. The energy swirling around them felt alive, pulsing with power that was far beyond their control. "What's happening?" Kale shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm as she reached for the crystal. Lyra's face was stricken with fear. The rift wasn't just a bridge for the void, it was a door. And now that it's closed, the forces on the other side are angry. They want to cross. And if they do, what happens? Kale asked, his voice urgent. "We all die." Lyra's words were simple, but the weight of them crushed any sense of hope that had remained in Kale's chest. A new rumble echoed through the chamber, louder and more intense than before. The walls cracked, and from the cracks, an eerie light began to leak out. Kale's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her back as the chamber shook violently. "We need to get out of here. Now." The two of them sprinted toward the exit, but as they turned the corner, they were met with an unexpected sight. Rorek, the once trusted ally, stood in their path. His face was twisted with a mixture of rage and madness. "You've sealed the rift," Rorek sneered, his voice cold. "But you've also opened a door to something far worse." Kale instinctively moved in front of Lyra, his body tense, ready to defend her. "What do you mean, Rorek? You think closing the rift stopped the destruction?" Rorek laughed darkly. "You've only triggered the beginning of the end. And now, the real enemy is coming for you." The tension in the chamber was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty and fear. Rorek stood before them, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto Kale and Lyra. The oppressive energy from the crystal had now spread throughout the room, the air feeling charged with danger. Kale's hand instinctively went to the weapon at his side, his instincts telling him that Rorek's appearance wasn't just a coincidence. "You're the last person I expected to see here," Kale said, his voice low and filled with suspicion. His body was tense, every muscle ready for a confrontation. "Why are you doing this?" Rorek smiled, a twisted, almost sadistic grin that made the hairs on the back of Kale's neck stand on end. "You think you've won, Kale?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think closing the rift was the answer? You've only set the stage for something far worse." Lyra stepped forward, her violet eyes narrowing as she confronted Rorek. "We sealed the rift. We stopped the void. What more do you want?" Rorek's expression darkened. "You think it's that simple? The rift was just a symptom of the real problem. It wasn't the cause. There's a much darker force at play here, Lyra. And I've been preparing for it, working for it." Kale's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. You're working with the void?" Rorek let out a low, mocking laugh. "No, Kale. I'm not working with it. I'm controlling it. I've spent years studying the rift, the energy that flows through it. And now, I have everything I need to harness that power and use it to reshape this world. To remake the universe in my image." "You're insane," Kale growled, stepping forward. "You'll destroy everything." Rorek shook his head slowly, the insanity in his eyes only growing. "I won't destroy everything. I'll remake it perfectly. And the first thing that will be destroyed is your precious planet. Aldera." Kale lunged at Rorek, but Lyra stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. Wait, Kale, she said softly, her voice filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. She turned toward Rorek, her face hardening. You betrayed us, Rorek. You've been playing us all along. Rorek's smile widened, the satisfaction in his eyes unmistakable. I didn't betray you, Lyra. I've always known what needs to be done. You and Kale, you're just pawns in a much bigger game. You thought you could stop the rift. But you've only unlocked its true potential. And now, I control it. With a swift movement, Rorek raised his hand, and the ground beneath them trembled violently. Kale felt the shift in the air as the very fabric of the chamber seemed to warp. The void had returned, its ominous presence seeping through the walls like an ancient nightmare clawing its way into reality. No, Lyra whispered, stepping back. You don't understand. The void can't be controlled. It will consume you. It will consume everything. But Rorek wasn't listening. He closed his eyes, basking in the dark power he had unleashed. I've already made my choice, he said softly, his voice distant. And now, the universe will follow me. Suddenly, the chamber was plunged into darkness. The walls around them seemed to dissolve, replaced by an endless void, a swirling mass of blackness and energy. Kale's heart raced as the temperature dropped, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over him. This was not just the void, it was something worse, something Rorek had summoned from the rift. Rorek, stop! Lyra cried, reaching out to him. You can't control it. But it was too late. The darkness began to pulse and surge, tendrils of pure shadow reaching toward them, lashing out like serpents. Kale grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her back as the void moved closer, its power growing with each passing second. We need to get out of here, Kale shouted, his mind racing. The rift that Rorek had unleashed was collapsing in on itself, and they were caught in its grasp. We can't run, Lyra said, her voice barely audible above the howling energy. We have to fight. We have to stop him. Rorek, standing in the center of the chaos, didn't even flinch. The void surrounded him like a cloak, its darkness wrapping around him. His face was illuminated only by the pale light of the swirling energy, and the expression on his face was one of absolute control. You think you can stop me, Lyra? He taunted, his voice mocking. You're too weak. You always were. With a swift motion, he raised his hands again, and the void's tendrils shot forward, aiming directly for Kale and Lyra. They barely had time to react before they were engulfed in darkness. Kale's mind raced as the world around him seemed to collapse. The energy of the rift had become an uncontrollable force. But there was one thing he knew: he couldn't let Rorek win. Not now, not after everything they had fought for. Lyra! Kale shouted over the roar of the void. We can stop him. We need to use the heart. It's the only way. Lyra looked at him, her face stricken with pain but determination shining in her eyes. The heart, it's the only way to close the rift, but we have to do it together, Kale. It's the only way to stop him. They both turned toward the heart of Althera, the crystal still glowing faintly, but now its energy felt distant, fragile. As the void closed in around them, Kale reached for Lyra's hand, the connection between them solidifying as they took their final stand against the darkness. The void pressed closer, its swirling tendrils wrapping around Kale and Lyra like an impenetrable wall of darkness. Kale felt the air around him grow colder, his breath coming in short bursts as he watched the chaos unfold. The energy that had once felt like power now seemed oppressive, suffocating, as if the very fabric of space was being torn apart around them. Lyra's hand was still in his, but even that small touch felt distant, as if she were slipping away from him. Her face, usually so strong and unwavering, was now etched with pain, her eyes filled with an uncertainty Kale had never seen before. "We have to close the rift, Lyra," Kale said, his voice urgent, but his chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "It's the only way. If we don't—" "I know," Lyra interrupted, her voice soft but steady. "But there's a cost, Kale. You felt it? We've both felt it?" Kale looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean? We've done everything. We've fought for this. We can stop him." Lyra swallowed hard, her gaze flicking toward Rorik, who stood in the center of the swirling darkness, his figure barely visible through the chaos. "It's not just about stopping him, Kale. It's about what we're giving up. The rift, the power of the void, they're tied to us now. To me. To you. To close it, we'll lose everything." Kale's heart skipped a beat. "Lose everything? What do you mean?" Lyra's eyes softened, and her grip on his hand tightened slightly. "The heart of Althera, it's the key to sealing the rift, but it also ties us to the rift's energy. If we use it to close the void for good, we won't just sever the rift's connection, we'll sever ours as well. Our bond. You and me." The words hit Kale like a hammer. The realization, the gravity of what she was saying, settled heavily on his chest. "You're telling me that closing the rift will tear us apart?" Kale whispered, the pain in his voice palpable. His mind reeled, struggling to process what Lyra had just revealed. Lyra nodded, her eyes not leaving his. "Yes. It's the only way to stop the void. To save Althera. To save everything. But in doing so, we will lose our connection. The bond we've shared. The energy that binds us will be severed, and you'll never be able to feel me again." Kale's chest tightened, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to slow. He couldn't imagine a world without Lyra, without the pull that had drawn them together, without the power of their shared energy. They had come so far together, fought side by side, and now the ultimate test had arrived. "I won't lose you," Kale said firmly, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch Lyra's face. The feeling of her skin against his, warm and alive, sent a surge of emotion rushing through him. "There has to be another way." Lyra's expression was one of quiet sadness, but there was strength in her voice. "I wish there were. But the rift can only be closed with the ultimate sacrifice. I can feel it, Kale. It's already beginning to pull at me. If we don't make this choice, everything will be lost. And I won't let that happen." The dark energy of the void around them shifted, like a wave crashing against their fragile shield. Rorik's twisted form appeared more powerful now, his eyes glowing with dark energy as he spoke from across the room. You think you can defeat me? You've sealed the rift, but you haven't stopped me. I control the void, now, and there's nothing you can do to change that. It's already too late. Kale turned to face him, his jaw tightening with resolve. You're wrong, Rorek. We've fought too long and too hard to let you destroy everything. I'm not giving up. Rorek laughed, his voice echoing with dark amusement. You still don't get it, do you, Kale? The void isn't just a force, it's a choice. And you've already made yours. You sealed the rift. But now, you'll have to pay the price. The ground beneath them rumbled again, but this time, it wasn't just the void. It was something else, a growing force, a pulsating wave of energy that began to radiate from the center of the chamber. Kale, Lyra said softly, but with a quiet strength, her voice cutting through the chaos. It's time. We have to do this now, or everything will be lost. Kale looked into her eyes, his heart heavy but his mind clear. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. Lyra was right. The sacrifice was inevitable, but they had come this far together, and now they had to face the truth. There was no other choice. Without another word, Kale moved to stand beside Lyra, his hand finding hers once again. They faced the heart of Alderaan together, their connection pulsing stronger than ever before. The energy between them was nearly overwhelming, but Kale knew they could do this. He knew they would do this. Together, he whispered. Together, Lyra echoed, her voice steady. They both placed their hands on the heart of Alderaan, and a surge of energy exploded around them. The light of the crystal blazed brighter than ever before, filling the chamber with an intense, blinding glow. The void screamed in rage, its tendrils thrashing wildly as the heart began to absorb its power. But just as the energy reached its peak, Kale and Lyra felt the pull. The rift, the bond that had connected them, began to tear apart. A sharp, searing pain shot through both of them, but they didn't let go. They couldn't. This was the only way. The ground trembled violently, and Kale's vision blurred as the world around him seemed to break apart. The connection between him and Lyra flickered, but just before it shattered completely, he felt her presence one last time, a wave of warmth, of love, that surged through him, making everything else disappear. And then, silence. The aftermath of the battle was silent. The explosive light that had filled the chamber slowly dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the heart of Alderaan to guide Kale and Lyra's exhausted forms. The rift had been closed. The void had been defeated. The universe had been saved. But at what cost? Kale sat in the quiet aftermath, his legs drawn up to his chest, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. His body felt empty, like a part of him had been ripped away. His heart still beating, still alive, was missing something. Or someone. Lyra was nearby, but she seemed distant. There was an emptiness in her eyes, a sadness that mirrored his own. They had sealed the rift together, had fought side by side. But now, the energy that had once flowed so easily between them was gone. The bond that had connected them, the very essence of their strength, had been severed in the final moments. Kale looked at her, the weight of the silence pressing between them. He wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't sure what he could say. Everything had changed. Lyra. His voice was soft, almost tentative. He had never felt so unsure. Are you all right? Lyra turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, once full of power and determination, were now tired, shadowed with the burden of their sacrifice. She had always been strong. But now, Kale could see the cracks in her facade. I will be, she replied quietly, her voice steady but hollow. Eventually. Kale's heart clenched as he watched her. The depth of her pain clearer than ever. I'm sorry, Lyra. Her gaze softened for just a moment, her lips curving slightly as if to reassure him. You have nothing to apologize for, Kale. We made the choice together. And it was the right one. Althara is safe. He nodded. But the pain in his chest didn't ease. They had saved their worlds. But the cost had been their connection, their bond. That was something Kale hadn't expected. And he wasn't sure how to deal with it. They both sat in silence for a while. The sound of their breathing the only noise in the chamber. The weight of their sacrifice hung between them. But there was no going back now. They had made the decision together. And they would have to live with it. Finally, Kale stood. His legs stiff from sitting too long. He reached his hand out toward Lyra, his voice low but full of conviction. Lyra, we did what we had to do. But now we need to figure out what comes next. She looked up at him, her expression softening. For the first time since the rift had closed, Kale saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. What comes next? Lyra repeated. Her voice thoughtful, almost as if she hadn't allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future before now. What do we do now? Kale took a deep breath, the weight of the question sinking in. He could feel the absence of their connection. But there was still a bond between them. It was different now, more fragile, perhaps. But it was still there. They had survived this together. And that meant something. We rebuild, Kale said, his voice steady and full of determination. We rebuild Althara. We rebuild what's been broken. And we find a new purpose. Together, we can still make something good out of this. Lyra stood slowly, her posture straight but weary. She looked at Kale for a long moment. And Kale saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Trust, maybe. Or perhaps the first steps toward healing. Together, she echoed softly. Yes. Together. For the first time in what felt like forever, they shared a smile. Quiet, unsure, but full of promise. It wasn't the same as before. Their bond had changed. But it had not disappeared completely. They had both lost something. But they had also gained something new. Understanding, resilience, and hope for the future. Kale stepped toward the exit, Lyra by his side. Their footsteps echoing through the chamber. As they emerged into the light of Althara's sky, the world around them seemed different. The planet had been saved. The rift closed. But the journey wasn't over. There was still so much to do. So much to rebuild. As they walked together into the future, Kale couldn't help but feel that, even without their old connection, they were beginning a new chapter. A new beginning. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the last pieces of the rift faded into the black void of space, a single thought echoed in my mind. Love doesn't need to be understood. It only needs to exist. And when it does, it's powerful enough to transcend time, space, and even the stars themselves. We fought. We bled. We sacrificed everything we knew to close the rift and save Althera from destruction. But in the end, the real battle wasn't against the void or the endless forces that threatened us. No. The true battle was something deeper. It was about understanding that sometimes, the love we seek isn't bound by our world or our rules. It's a force so powerful that it redefines everything we thought we knew about connection. The greatest challenge wasn't the universe or the impossible odds we faced. The real challenge was finding out whether love, in its purest form, could survive when the universe itself tried to tear it apart. But the truth is, love doesn't need to make sense. And sometimes, the most beautiful stories aren't the ones we can explain. They're the ones that defy logic, that don't fit in the boxes we create for them. So, here's the question for you. Can love truly have no boundaries? Can it break through the vastness of space, the coldness of time? Or is that just a dream we tell ourselves to feel less alone? Maybe we'll never know for sure. But here's what I do know. This journey, this adventure of the heart, isn't over. Not yet. So, if you believe that love can transcend anything, even the universe itself, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe because this journey is just beginning, and you're part of it. We're all explorers on this cosmic quest. Let's see where this story leads us next.